Welcome to the October 2022 edition of Hunt Camp Mail. This is the month where we're haunted by that big buck we couldn't close in on and terrified at the thought of missing the upland opener. Deer season is over in some places and it's just began in others, and I hope you did good this year. I know out west, this drought hasn't been good for the deer populations. Also, as we get into the thick of the fall season, wing shooting occupies the spare time of many of my viewers. I know I'm in full bird hunting mode right now. Having cleared my mailbox of Africa-related questions in an earlier video, I can now get back to normal Hunt Camp Mail questions like you expect. So grab your favorite adult beverage, sit back, and relax as we cover some interesting questions and topics. Our first question for October is from Bruce in Vermont. Bruce wrote, "Hi Desert Dog, this is Bruce from Vermont. I've been watching your videos and I do value your opinion on many different subjects. However, I have to say for what you do and the level that you do it, you totally live in the wrong state. Did you ever think about moving to a more gun-friendly state?" Well, of course I have. I'd be crazy not to, but I'm currently stuck in the state of California because my business is tied to it. Specifically, my expertise requires me to be in my current location. But when I retire, I'll definitely be gone. Probably to some place like Utah, because I need to live in a place with a lot of public land to hunt, fish, and off-road on. But I will miss hunting, fishing, and off-roading in California because the opportunities here are just unlimited. The hunting, fishing, and off-roading opportunities in California are actually better than most states. And our next question is from Michael in Davis, California. Michael wrote, "I purchased a Browning X-Bolt and was looking at 3 scopes, the Leupold VX5 HD in either 2 to 10 by 44 or 3 to 15 by 44 with the fire dot reticle, or the Trijicon AccuPoint 2.5 to 12 by 44. I hear good things about both brands, but only have owned Trijicon ACOGs and love their glass quality. I like the idea of the fiber optics powering the Trijicon scope, but if the glass quality is more favorable in the Leupold, I think that would be better for low light conditions. Since both are comparatively priced, which would you recommend and why?" One of these hypothetical scope questions here. Personally, and this is just my personal opinion, you asked for it, that's what you're going to get. I'd only go with the Trijicon if you could find that duplex reticle with the dot in the middle of it. Stay away from those other reticles for hunting. It's more of a tactical reticle than a hunting reticle, and I don't like those other reticles, to tell you the truth. Maybe, for CBQ self-defense situation, but, definitely not for hunting. But the AccuPoint is actually a few $100s more expensive than the VX5 HD. They're not the same price, but I think the build quality on the AccuPoint might be a little bit better, so that would account for the price difference right there. But if you want to talk about the Leupold VX6 HD scopes, I think they're definitely better than the AccuPoints as a pure hunting scope, but you'll pay more for those. And our next question is from Paul. Paul didn't say where he was from. Paul wrote, "I recently picked up a Tang Safety M77 and 308 Winchester. All excited with my new old gun, I headed to the range with some reloads that were made up for a Ruger American that has since been sold. Less than 50% of the cartridges actually fired. Those that did not showed indentations in the primer but failed to ignite. Talk about rain on my parade. I immediately questioned the decision to buy an older style M77. My first thought was the reloads were corrupted, but thinking back to the Ruger American, I never had issues with failure to ignite. In your experience, do the bolt springs weaken enough to cause a less powerful primer strike? Is it possible the firing pin could be that worn that is now too short to fully impact? Have you ever seen or heard of a similar problem in your experience and dealing with the M77? Well, figuring out this problem is going to be a process of deduction that you have to do on your own. Are you seeding your primers all the way till they bottom out in the primer pocket? Because that's important, and you'll get light primer strikes and fail to ignite if that's not the case. Did you thoroughly clean the bolt in all of its parts? And I mean, take down everything, soak it, lubricate what needs to be lubricated. Did you do that? If not, that old 30-year-old Tang safety gun, that might be the problem with it. Have you measured firing pin protrusion and verified that that's within specs? I mean, you can look that up online yourself and verify that with micrometers. Have you compared your full-length size brass to fired brass? Have you used a gauge to see if you have headspace issues? Light primer strikes can happen with any rifle, and a simple process of elimination will almost always find the problem. If you aren't capable of such things, take your gun to any gunsmith and he'll probably find the issue relatively quick. And our next question is from Jim in Alabama. Jim wrote, I would really enjoy your thoughts and suggestions on what to include in your day pack for a day hunt. Here in Alabama, we hunt from elevated ladder stands and climbing stands, so it may not fit your Western day hunt with boots on the ground. However, your thoughts on appropriate gear and safety equipment would be much appreciated. Well, thanks for the letter, Jim. And what myself or anyone else put in their day pack will vary wildly between hunting styles, hunting areas, and weather conditions. I wouldn't even know how to pack for a ladder stand or tree saddle hunt, to tell you the truth. So any video I did on packing for a day hunt would be specific to what I do and would probably be of no value to you. And our next letter is from Chris from British Columbia, Canada. Chris wrote, a commonly cited reliable sign for an overpressure load is the combination of a heavy bolt lift and ejector wipe ring markings on the base of the case. All examples of this I'm able to find always reference the circle of a plunger ejector. My worry is that when using a bolt face which features a blade ejector, such as on a Model 70, the square slot may not afford brass to flow as easily as the plunger hole in a push feed action bolt face. Given your experience in both reloading and with controlled round feed rifles, can you shed any light on this? Sure. You won't always have ejector marks with the Mauser style blade ejector. I mean, that's just a fact. But sometimes the brass will flow a little into the ejector slot and leave a mark on the case head, of an overpressure load. I've seen it before on controlled round feed rifles. But as you pointed out in your letter, this doesn't always happen. But there's plenty of other signs to look for. You've already mentioned bolt lift, which is also a pretty reliable indicator of overpressure. But you didn't mention inspecting the primer for signs. And remember, it's common knowledge, and I agree with it, that primer signs aren't a reliable indicator of overpressure if you're not intimately familiar with your primer and brass combination. You have to know how the primers you're using behave in order to get an accurate read on them. Basically, some primers are just softer than others, and some brass is softer than other brass. So you have to know how flat a particular primer gets when you hit an overpressure event. Also, data from a good chronograph can be combined with powder charge and seating depth numbers to give you pretty close pressure estimates. Programs like Quick Load can do this for you. And I've used it in the past all the time, especially when I'm starting something new that I'm not very familiar with. But for me, I work up loads utilizing proper load development. And when I'm doing an optimal charge weight test, I look for sudden jumps in velocity over a couple tenths of grains of powder weights. Running numbers has confirmed to me that this is normally where an overpressure event is occurring. So there's lots of things to look for when watching for pressure signs during load development, other than just ejector marks. Our next question is from Dimitri in Southern California. Dimitri wrote, many shotgun manufacturers advise not using steel through anything tighter than a modified choke. For my hunt, I'll be using a Carlson TSS 650 turkey choke along with Fiocchi Golden Turkey TSS number 9. From what I've been reading, tungsten is harder than steel. This is where I get confused. If tungsten is harder than steel, then how are you able to shoot it through full or turkey chokes without causing damage to your barrel? And that's actually a good common sense question, Dimitri. And the answer to it is that it's all in the size of the shot being used. Steel shot requires, number 4 or number 5 shot for turkey hunting, where TSS uses number 9 shot for the same birds. The smaller TSS pellets tend to flow like sand within the wad while they're traveling through the choke. Where large steel BBs tend to resist flowing within the wad as they travel through the choke. So steel and TSS are both hard enough to damage a choke, but the smaller TSS pellets flow within the wad better and put less stress on the choke tube. This is why most chokes rated for steel have a shot size limitation on them. In addition to this, you'll notice that TSS specific chokes have less restriction than those intended for use with lead. And our next question is from Josh. Josh didn't say where he was from. Josh asked, I would really like a rifle chambered in 300 H&H, but I'm not aware of any production rifles currently chambering for it. Would you recommend I try a pre-64 action and have a gunsmith build me one? Well, of course I would, but you're definitely gonna need to have a rifle built or rebarreled for a 300 H&H. No mass-produced commercial rifle is currently chambered for it, which is regrettable. Just remember that you must have a receiver with a magnum action on it to do this. The easiest way to make a 300 H&H is to find a rifle chambered in 375 H&H and have it rebarreled. A 375 H&H is the perfect donor action for a 300 H&H build. And our next question is from Salvador in Visalia, California. Salvador wrote, I just watched your Towers of Death video. That was crappy of that oil company to do this. You should have told us the name of the oil company so we can put the corporate office on blast. Oil companies are completely destroying our habitat, and I'm sick of it. My advice to you, Salvador, is to back off for a minute and just think. Use reason here. Most people familiar with oil fields know that they actually contain a lot of wildlife. Have you ever wondered why oil leases are full of animals? It's because the oil industry brought water to places where water didn't exist before. This presence of water in formerly desolate places supports an entire ecosystem that depends on it. But this is a double-edged sword because oil fields have many hazards for animals. So this is an environment that supports so many animals, but it can also kill them. Let me tell you a true story that I was involved in. One of the largest oil companies in the world decided to shut down a lease and donate the land to a popular conservation organization. And this was part of a settlement over the endangered leopard lizard. This lease did have lots of leopard lizards living on it. So, kicking out the oil company seemed pretty logical, right? As a condition of this transfer of ownership, the oil company was tasked with removing all man-made structures, including roads, and returning the entire lease to its natural state. My company was hired to demolish all the tanks on this lease. That's why I'm familiar with this case. After 5 years of this land being returned back to its natural state, the leopard lizard completely disappeared from this area. You couldn't find one anymore. So what they did was they removed the artificial water sources from the area, and the entire ecosystem on that lease collapsed in less than 5 years. So when I look at the hunting area in my Towers of Death video, I also have to consider the possibility that large numbers of quail might be in this area because of that oil lease. We can't let emotion get the best of us and act in haste. Problems have to be looked at from multiple angles, and that oil lease very well could be a good thing. But here's my real problem with the whole Towers of Death situation. They should have installed those speakers inside the lease near the hazard that they're attempting to keep the animals away from. Placing them right against the fence line on the public land boundary seems short-sighted and almost gives the impression that they're deliberately targeting animals on public land. But I am currently communicating with people from the oil company on this issue, and I'll try to get back to you if I get a response at all. And our next letter is from Shane from South Dakota. Shane wrote, an expert YouTuber said that bismuth shot needs to be choked very tight in order to function. This doesn't seem to make sense to me. What are your thoughts on selecting a choke for bismuth? I'll be using Boss shells. You must be hunting public land in South Dakota, just like I plan to this year. Lead needs a tight choke because it deforms in flight, and the patterns of it open up because the pellets get deformed. Steel doesn't deform at all, so it keeps a nice pattern with a more open choke. I'd say that bismuth acts somewhere in between those two. Boss copper-plated bismuth pellets seem nice and round, so they don't really deform. They stay nice and round, giving it some tighter patterns like steel. But bismuth is brittle, so you don't want to over-choke it and break up the pellets, which will cause the pattern to fall apart. So you can over-choke bismuth. And I mean, I've proven it in the past on the patterning board to where I was shooting bismuth pellets and I cut open a couple of shells and all the BBs were nice, round, perfect BBs of uniform size. And the holes in my patterning board in the paper didn't reflect that. There was little tiny holes all over the place in it, which tells me that the bismuth was breaking apart en route to the target, which isn't good. So I definitely believe you can overchoke bismuth if you want to. I'm running Boss shells this season on everything. I mean, doves, quail, pheasants, and ducks, and chukar. I'll do an honest review of them this winter after bird hunting season's over. But so far, there's some good and some bad to report with the Boss shells. But before you go out and buy a choke, let me tell you what I've noticed with the Boss shells and chokes so far. Boss shells are very sensitive to chokes. So you need to try several of them out. Also, Boss shells hate wad stripping chokes like Pattern Masters. The Boss shells, coupled with my Pattern Master chokes, were literally some of the most inconsistent patterns I've ever seen. So stay away from the Pattern Master chokes when you're using the Boss shells. And compared to other bismuth shell manufacturers, it's been my experience that Boss shells do need a little bit of a tighter choke, or they're capable of handling a little bit of a tighter choke. If you're accustomed to other bismuth brands like Kent, Boss shells with a full choke act more like Kent shells with an improved modified choke. So far, I've noticed that going up one choke size, going up in one constriction, works best sometimes with the Boss shot shells. And our next letter is from Jake. Jake asked me a bunch of questions, but I'll pick a couple and answer those. Jake asked, in your Zambezi hunting video, you zoom in on the tail of the buffalo you shot. The hairs on the end of the tail appear to be in a knot, and I'm not sure if that knot was made by coincidence or by human hands. What is the significance of that? Also, you said you put the buffalo on salt. What does that mean? Be happy to answer this for you, Jake. Tying buffalo tail hair in a knot is an ancient custom in African cultures. In some African cultures, the knot prevents those who eat the animal's flesh from having that animal's pain transferred to them. You know, it basically protects the hunting party from spiritual repercussions. But in remote southern African cultures, the knot in the buffalo's tail is said to help the buffalo transition to the afterlife. And it's considered a sign of ultimate respect for that animal. When I, stooped over and tied that knot in my buffalo's tail, the trackers instantly stopped what they were doing and thanked me for it. On to your last question. After you kill an animal in Africa, it's quickly skinned and the flesh is quickly boiled off the head. Then after this, the head and the hide is placed in salt. And the salt absorbs the moisture and keeps all the bacteria in check. You know, the salt is what preserves the hide and keeps it from decaying. So after a hunter kills an animal and returns it to camp for processing, we say it's in the salt. And our next question is from Steve from Texas. Steve wrote, doves are not upland birds. Stop calling them that. It makes you look stupid. Well, I'm sorry, Steve. I didn't want to do it this month, but you're getting the button. Bullshit! 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 You see, Steve, our game birds are divided into two main categories, upland and wetland. Wetland birds need to be in or near water to breed, raise their young, and usually eat too most of the time. Upland birds generally only need water for drinking, and they live almost a completely terrestrial life. So ducks, geese, and coots are considered wetland birds, and quail, pheasants, partridge, turkeys, and doves are considered upland birds. And our next question is from Sunny in Wyoming. Sunny wrote, I guess I'll have to agree with most of what you said about the 4570 in your video, except the part where you said that the 4570 was not the most popular bison gun. I know people with deep history in this state who know for a fact that more buffalo were killed with the 4570 than with any other round. Ugh. You know, rather than telling you that you're wrong, Sonny, you know, I'll give you some facts to consider, and we'll just leave it at that. You know, hopefully you'll consider what I present to you, and we'll settle our gentleman's disagreement. You know, neither of us were alive before the American bison almost went extinct, and, you know, neither was anyone we know. No one we know was even alive then. So we have to dig up pieces of information from the past and form an opinion based off that. So that's what I'll do in my answer to your statement. I put this chart together to give you a timeline for both cartridge history and the demise of the American bison. You know, you could see that in 1840, muzzle loaders like the Hawk and rifle are popular with hunters in the buffalo ranges. And at the time, there was an estimated 35 million buffalo. Then by 1866, there was only 10 million buffalo left. So this shows you that those old black powder muzzle loaders and like the Hawk and rifle were probably, as far as if you want to go by rifles, that was the rifle that probably did the most devastation right there. But who's to say there was also disease and other things as factors. But we're talking about rifle cartridges on buffalo here. In 1866, the U.S. military officially converts to Remington rolling block rifles chambered in 50-70. And then by 1880 over here, over 1 million of those are made. A year later, in 1867, the U.S. military converts all of its Sharps rifles in inventory to 50-70. And these rifles were sent to the cavalry units out west. So there's a lot of those out on the western frontier in the height of the buffalo slaughter. Then a year after that, in 1868, the Remington Rolling Block No. 1 sporting rifle was released in 50-70, and that quickly became the most popular sporting rifle in the United States. And that same year, the government was sponsoring bison eradication efforts, of course, mostly against the Indians. In 1871, the Sharps Model 1874 is released. I know that's called the 1874, but it was released in 1871. And its most popular chambering is 44-77, 50-70, and 50-90. And by 1871, look at this, only 5 million buffalo left. And this year also marks the peak of the bison trade. And there was 10,000 hunters per day pouring into the plains to hunt bison, mainly due to the railroad. In 1873, the U.S. Army accepted the 45-70 as its new standard cartridge, and Springfield began production of the Model 1873. And by this time, look there's only 2 million bison left. Just before this, over 3 million bison were killed between 1872 and 1873. Isn't that crazy? 3 million bison killed in 2 years. In 1874, the Remington Rolling Block chambered in 45-70 was sold to the civilian market. So this is really when the 45-70 started getting into the hands of hunters out on the western frontier. But by 1874, the big southern herds were completely wiped out, and bison hunting was starting to get regulated at this time also. By 1875, the U.S. Army began dumping its huge supply of 50-70 rifles and ammunition to the surplus market. Rumor had it there were some writings that the military out on the frontier in the West, the army forts, were giving out 50-70 ammunition free to, basically as much as people could carry. And a lot of these surplus rifles, were sold for dirt cheaper, given away to settlers or natives that were friendly to the government. And by 1875, only 600,000 bison left. By 1882, the 45-70 was firmly established as the rifle cartridge of choice, but by then, the big northern herds were completely wiped out. And of course, by about 1883, the bison was on the brink of complete extinction. But as you can see in this chart right here that I made, this overview, you could see that the 45-70 wasn't in the hands of the public until 1874. And by that time, the bison was almost completely wiped out. And even, while the 45-70 was around, the market was still being flooded with 50-70 rifles and ammunition. So the actual era of the 45-70 was too late for it to be the most popular buffalo hunting cartridge. In fact, it's statistically impossible for the 45-70 to have been responsible for even an appreciable percentage of the bison deaths. Logically speaking, the 45-70 was actually an insignificant part of the demise of the bison. If the chart I just showed you with the timeline doesn't convince you, here's further evidence that the 45-70 was not the most popular bison hunting cartridge. The most famous trading post of the bison hunting area was the Adobe Walls Trading Post. Not only was this a popular trading post with bison hunters, but it was also the site of a big 1874 battle between buffalo hunters and native tribes. Some famous Old West legends such as Bat Masterson and Billy Nixon were involved in this battle. A meticulous archaeological excavation took place at this site in 1978, and many cartridge cases were recovered during that excavation. The cartridge cases found at the site were all 4477, 4490, 5070, 5090, and no 4570 cartridge cases were found. So if you were sitting at a real trading post in the mid-1870s, you wouldn't see any buffalo hunters' rifles chambered in 4570. Also, there's sales information that Frank Conrad sold rifles and ammunition at Fort Griffin from 1871 to 1880. According to his written accounts, most rifles that hunters carried and purchased at the trading post were Sharps 44 and 50 caliber rifles. And I posted on here what some of the most famous buffalo hunters used. The most famous buffalo hunter of them all, Buffalo Bill Cody, used a Remington rolling block in 5070. The deadliest buffalo hunter of all time, Jim White, also known as the Boss Hunter, used a 50 caliber Sharps. Frank Mayer shot a Sharps chambered in the hard-hitting 45 120 cartridge. Victor Grant Smith, or Yellowstone Vic, used a pair of 50 caliber Sharps rifles. He basically would swap between them as the barrels got hot. He shot that many buffalo. General George Custer hunted with a sporterized Remington rolling block in 5070, and Bat Masterson used a 50 caliber Sharps rifle. So these facts seem to indicate that the 4570 really played an insignificant role in the demise of the bison. As a matter of fact, the 5070 was around during the majority of the killings since 1866. And even after the 4570 was released, it seemed like most frontiersmen were still using 5070 rifles. And no famous buffalo hunter that I can think of killed bison with the 4570. In fact, even after the 4570 was established, it seemed like professional buffalo hunters preferred the more powerful Sharps long-range cartridges like the 4490, the 5090, and the 45 120. So during the buffalo slaughter, the 4570 was almost an insignificant factor. And our last question is from David in California. David wrote, "From what I've heard, quail numbers are not that great in California again this year. Are you planning on skipping the season in hopes of letting the numbers recuperate for next season?" Well, David, last year was absolutely horrible for the quail and the chukar. I went to a couple of my spots and decided to basically quit hunting quail after opening weekend last year. The coveys I did see were very small. I scouted everywhere from the eastern Sierras to the central coast, and numbers were bad just about everywhere last year. But I'm seeing very good numbers this year. I saw a lot of quail on my scouting trips this year, and I bumped a covey of 30 birds on opening day if you watched my Towers of Death video. Most of the folks I know who went out for the opener this year did decently. But then again, most of the guys I personally know also put in the time to scout a lot of different areas. If I do see the numbers get bad in an area where I hunt, I leave them alone and let them recover. But I haven't seen any cause for alarm this year. We actually got some good summer rains in California, which I think helped the quail out a lot. And longtime subscriber of my channel, Josh Lowe, has been busting some geese this year already, and he sent me a picture of his delicious looking goose pastrami. If this doesn't make you hungry, I don't know what will. Well, that wraps up October's Hunt Camp Mail. Here's some memes for this month. have some great video ideas coming up for November and December, but I'll refrain from giving them up so they don't end up being featured on other channels. But please have a safe Halloween and enjoy the beautiful fall weather while you can. You can reach me with any questions or comments at desertdogoutdoors@gmail.com. Thanks for watching, and as always, good hunting.